Okay, so in today's video, let's talk about saving, and in particular, I want to talk about what you should be doing if you find that you keep dipping into your savings. Now, this definitely happened to me in the past. So before, when I started learning about things like money management, I had the budget ready, I was trying to save money, but every single time I tried to save, I felt like I was taking a step backwards because I would always end up dipping into my savings because expenses would come up, and then I would just get really discouraged because I thought I was still saving money, but then because I was having to use those savings, I felt like I was back at ground zero. So in this video, I want to give some tips and share with you why you might be dipping into your savings and how you can actually overcome that, allowing you to actually be able to save money. So without further ado, let's get started. So I will say that when it comes to dipping into your savings, one of the biggest reasons why that might be happening is because you haven't necessarily created a system that allows you to not only save money separately, but to also prepare for upcoming expenses. And what I mean by this is, say you're doing your monthly budget every single month without fail, and you have an idea in terms of how much your monthly expenses come to. And so these are expenses that you typically pay for monthly. So it could be groceries, rent, mortgage, utility bills, even things like eating out that comes out of your budget. You know you set a budget for that monthly. However, when it comes to other upcoming expenses, some of those may not be paid monthly. In fact, you may only pay for it once, or you may only pay for it once a year. So as an example, in my case, when I was trying to save money and I was trying to save my first 500 before trying to save 1,000, I made many mistakes doing that. But one of the mistakes I realized was that I didn't take into consideration some of those upcoming expenses. So I remember when I was trying to first save money, I hadn't planned that my graduation was coming up and I would need to pay for that. And that was an extra upcoming expense that wasn't a part of my monthly expenses because it only happens once. I wasn't graduating every single month, right? And so because of that, I hadn't actually planned to pay for things like my graduation ticket, the robe, or anything like that. And so when it came to the next month and I realized I had to pay for all those things, I hadn't necessarily planned for that in my budget. And so I ended up having to, again, dip into my savings to pay for that expense because I hadn't planned for it in advance. And so when I'm talking about creating a system that allows you to prepare for those upcoming expenses, yes, having the budget is going to be important because obviously you want to plan how you want to spend your money over the week or month. But when I'm talking about the actual system, I'm also talking about upcoming expenses that may not be in your monthly budget all the time. And so this is where things like sinking funds can be really helpful, because this will allow you to actually plan for some of those expenses that you know will probably come up, but it may be slightly separate to the way you spend your money each month. So let me talk through what sinking funds are and explain how it can really work and help you to stop dipping into your savings. And if you're liking this video so far, then feel free to give me a thumbs up, as it really does help to support the channel, plus it's free. So when it comes to sinking funds, these are just expenses that you will save up for over time. And so for me, having sinking funds can actually be really powerful, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I stopped dipping into my savings, because it allowed me to start saving for those upcoming expenses in advance. And it meant that when those expenses came up, I already had the money for them, so I wouldn't have to dip into my savings, or I wouldn't have to take it out of my paycheck for that month. And so as an example, when it comes to things like car maintenance, so if you know that you're going to have to pay for car insurance every year, or if you know that you're going to have to pay for road coverage every year, you could actually set up a sinking fund for that. So you could decide that you're going to set up a pot of money and save for that little by little to then pay for that expense later on. And so again, if I'm using the car example, if I know that I'm going to have to pay about 500 for road coverage and insurance next year, what I could do today is tell myself, okay, I have 12 months to set aside money to pay for that expense next year. And so if I divide 500 by 12 months, that means that all I need to do is just start setting aside about 42 each month in order for me to reach that 500 next year. And so what that means is that come next year, when I now have to pay for that expense, because I've already been saving up for it over the past few months, I will have the money ready to then use to pay for that expense. And so what that potentially means is that either I don't have to fork out 500 out of my one paycheck, or I don't have to actually dip into my other savings because I would have already been saving up for that over time. And also remember, when it comes to sinking funds, this can actually be for anything. So any upcoming expense that you know you don't typically pay for that regularly, for example, every week or every month, you could simply just set up a sinking fund. So I remember having a client who actually wanted to set up a fund purely for concerts, because she wanted to get to a point where if, let's say, her favorite artist was coming down to London and they were doing a flash sale on concert tickets, she wanted to have money ready for that so that she wouldn't again have to either dip into her savings or just use her paycheck, meaning that she would have less money to spend throughout the month. So by setting up a sinking fund, what that meant is that every month she was just putting little by little money into that fund dedicated for concerts, so that whenever she actually decided, oh, I would really love to go to this concert, she would just go to that fund and use the money from that fund. And I will say, I feel like with many of us, we feel like sinking funds should be quote unquote for important expenses. So things like car insurance and car maintenance will be important because obviously maybe you need to use your car to drive to work. But I would argue that sinking funds can literally be for anything. And so even when I'm talking to my clients, I'm telling them it doesn't just have to be for things like car insurance or your home insurance, for example. It could be for anything else. For example, it could be because you would love to have a really amazing Christmas and you know you want to spend a lot of money during Christmas, but you don't want to be broke by the time it gets to January. Well, what you could do is again create a sinking fund for that, so you can just be setting money aside each week, each month, or each quarter. It really doesn't matter, but you know that just by setting aside a small amount will then start to add up by the time it comes to Christmas time. I've even had clients create sinking funds literally for eating out. And the reason why they do that is because they know that sometimes there are going to be months that they eat out a lot more often compared to other months. So for example, you may realize that you tend to eat out a lot more when it comes to the summer, but during the winter, you don't really typically leave your house that often, and so you don't really eat out. And so what they've been able to do is literally just set up a fund so that during the winter, when they're not eating out that often, they will set aside money getting ready for the summer, so that when it comes to the summer, they can still be able to eat out. But again, it is not at a detriment to their current paycheck, and they're not having to dip into their savings to do that either. Okay, so now you might be asking, right, I understand that in order for me to stop dipping into my savings, part of it is going to be for me to actually plan for those upcoming expenses. But how do I actually set up those funds? Like, how do I set up a sinking fund, and how do I actually plan it out? So what I would say is, first, before you start creating all of these sinking funds, I would almost look back and ask yourself, why did I end up dipping into those savings in the first place? Was there an upcoming expense that always happens that I just haven't planned for? Because that will then help you figure out actually what kind of sinking funds you might want to start creating. So again, if we take my case, yes, graduation was one thing that I missed out, but also again, when it came to car insurance and car maintenance, I didn't necessarily plan for that either. And so that meant that every year I would either have to pay out of my whole paycheck, which meant that I would have less money to spend during the month, or I would have to dip into my savings, of course. And so because I knew that that would happen all the time, I realized that I actually needed a sinking fund for my car insurance, because that is one of the biggest expenses that happens every year that I'm just never prepared for. So take a look at maybe the past few months of your bank statements and see if there are any expenses that are usually just maybe a one-off cost or something that you tend to pay for once a year, and ask yourself, should I be creating a sinking fund for that to make it easier for me to plan for over the next year? Then once you've done that, you kind of want to just think about what sinking funds you could potentially have that's going to make life a bit easier for you. So if you know again that there are some expenses that you would love to just have planned in advance and you would love to just have the money set aside for that already, well then start planning for it. What are the different categories you're gonna have, and how much are they likely to cost? So again, if you use the car insurance as an example, you may have a look at your past expenses and know that that it's going to be around 500 or 1,000. And then when it comes to things like Christmas or birthdays, you may also want to set aside a certain amount as well. Again, those numbers don't have to be like the absolute correct number. You can of course change them, but what it does is it gives you some guidance so that you can start figuring out how much you would like to start setting aside. And then once you've got your total cost, you can then decide how much you would like to set aside, maybe each month or maybe each quarter or each week. Honestly, it doesn't matter, but you just want to figure out how much you would love to set aside based on your own budget. So if, for example, you've looked at my past budget updates, you will see that we actually have a dedicated section for sinking funds. So there are certain categories that we set aside money for literally every single month to build up our pot. And so what that means is that when we get paid monthly, we will set some money aside dedicated just for those sinking funds. And so every month we're just putting a little amount into those pots. And so we don't really feel it when it comes to our actual paychecks. But after a few months, what we tend to see is we actually have quite a bit of money there. And so we're then able to use it whenever we need to. And so what you might find is that by having those sinking funds and being prepared for those upcoming expenses, what that allows you to do is now focus on saving for other things. So actually focus on your other financial goals. Maybe you're trying to save for your first house or an emergency fund, or maybe you're even trying to save so that you can start investing for financial independence. Having those sinking funds actually now then prepares you for those expenses so that you can almost separate out those other savings. And so you're less likely to dip into your savings because the upcoming expenses that you would have had to pay for have already been taken into consideration by creating those sinking funds. Now, if you've maybe realized that now is the time that you just want to stop dipping into your savings and you would really love support in terms of being able to actually save more money, then definitely check out my one-on-one coaching, because what I can do is help you to actually create a system so that when you get paid, you are still able to save more, you're able to create those sinking funds, and that will stop you from dipping into your savings so that you can finally start working towards your other financial goals. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. You can book a free call just to find out more about the program. So I'll link more information up here for you and in the description below. So if there's anything you take from this video, remember that part of the reason why we tend to dip into our savings is purely because we just haven't planned for those upcoming expenses. So if you can pre-plan for those in advance and start setting money aside, you might realize that you're less likely to dip into your savings because you've almost separated those expenses out. And so it means that it allows you to now focus on actually saving for things that truly matter to you. So if you haven't started doing things like sinking funds yet, then I would highly recommend you try them out. So if you did like this video, then please do give me a thumbs up if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments, are you thinking about having sinking funds? What kind of categories would you have? I do post every Tuesday, so if you would like to know more, then of course you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next week.